In the neon-lit concrete jungle of the city, Kang Seojun was a man who moved like a ghost and struck like a blade. At just 32, he had ascended to the throne of the most feared Korean syndicate, his body a canvas of ink that told the story of 1,000 battles. He lived by a singular, cold philosophy. Everyone has a price, and everyone is hiding something. But then there was Danielle Brooks. For months, the most dangerous man in the city sat at a corner table of a high-end bistro, captivated not by the food, but by the quiet grace of a woman who seemed untouched by the darkness he breathed. Danielle was a mystery he couldn't solve, until he noticed the bags. Every night at closing, she vanished into the freezing city streets, clutching heavy containers of stolen leftovers. In Seojun's world, a secret was always a weapon. Was she working for a rival? Was the woman he loved actually his greatest threat? On a Tuesday night, hidden behind a crumbling stone wall with his hand on his weapon, Seojun watched her approach a shadowy figure in the dark. What he saw next didn't just shock him, it shattered his cold heart forever. Stop. Before we go any further, I need to warn you. You are about to witness a revelation that will completely change how you see human nature. In about 35 minutes, when the credits roll and you're staring at your screen wondering how a story could be this powerful, you're going to wish you hit that like and subscribe button. But by then, you'll be too caught up in the emotion to remember. So do yourself a favor, join our community now while your heart is still steady, because trust me, you are not ready for the twist coming. The black sedan was a silent phantom, gliding through the rain-slicked arteries of the city with its lights extinguished. Behind the wheel, Seojun's knuckles were white against the leather. His heart, usually a cold, rhythmic machine, hammered against his ribs with a frantic energy he hadn't felt since his first turf war. This wasn't supposed to be difficult. He was a man who had dismantled syndicates and stared down the barrels of assassins' rifles without a tremor in his hands. Yet, as he watched the taillights of the bus carrying Danielle, his breath came in shallow, jagged bursts. He kept a 3-car distance, his eyes locked on the silhouette behind the fogged glass. Every time the bus lurched to a halt at a dilapidated corner, a spike of adrenaline surged through him. He imagined her meeting a contact, perhaps a mole from the triads or a desperate informant looking to sell his head for a bounty. The thought of her betrayal felt like a physical weight in his lungs, a suffocating pressure that made him want to roar at the windshield. He had let her in. He had sat at her station, watched her gentle hands pour his coffee, and for the first time in a decade, he had allowed himself to feel something other than the numb cold of authority. The bus finally groaned to a stop at the edge of the Old Stone District, a place where the street lamps flickered like dying stars, and the shadows seemed to have teeth. Danielle stepped off, the 2 heavy bags pulling at her shoulders, making her slight frame look even more fragile against the backdrop of crumbling brick and rusted iron. She didn't look back. She didn't check for tails. She simply walked with a purposeful, rhythmic gait that spoke of a woman who had memorized every crack in the pavement. Seojun abandoned the car 2 blocks away, moving into the darkness. He shed the persona of the mafia boss and became the predator he was trained to be. He moved through the alleys, his expensive Italian shoes stepping over broken glass and stagnant puddles without making a sound. The scent of ozone and wet trash filled his senses, but all he could focus on was the flash of her white apron beneath her coat. She turned into a narrow passage behind a massive, weathered stone bridge, a relic of the city's industrial past. Seojun felt his blood turn to ice. This was a dead end, a perfect spot for a clandestine exchange. He reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of his weapon. His mind raced through a dozen scenarios, each ending in a different kind of tragedy. He reached the corner of the bridge's support pillar and pressed his back against the rough, damp stone. He could hear voices now, low, muffled, and desperate. His jaw tightened. He took a long, steadying breath, counting to 3 just as he had been taught. He swung his body around the edge of the wall, eyes narrowed and ready to strike, only to find himself paralyzed. There was no rival boss. There was no exchange of envelopes or flash drives. Instead, in the flickering amber glow of a single, naked bulb, he saw Danielle kneeling in the dirt. She was reaching into one of the bags, her face illuminated by a smile so radiant it seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. As Seojun watched from the safety of the shadows, the dangerous secret he had been hunting began to unravel in the most unexpected way possible. Seojun remained pressed against the damp masonry, his heart performing a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. The scene before him felt like a hallucination, a glitch in the harsh reality he had inhabited for over 30 years. In the center of the small, sheltered alcove beneath the bridge, Danielle was no longer the quiet, subservient waitress who poured his tea with downcast eyes. She moved with a gentle, commanding authority, her white apron glowing like a beacon in the gloom. An elderly man, his face a map of deep-seated weariness and silver stubble, sat on a discarded milk crate. This was Harold Thompson. His hands, gnarled and trembling, reached out as Danielle carefully opened one of the heavy containers. The steam rose in a fragrant plume, smelling of roasted chicken and seasoned vegetables, the very same high-end cuisine that Seojun's elite clients paid hundreds of dollars to ignore while they discussed territory and blood. "Careful, Harold, it's still hot," Danielle murmured, her voice carrying a melodic warmth that seemed to take the edge off the biting wind. She didn't just hand him the food. She knelt on the dirty concrete, meeting his eyes with a level of respect that Seojun hadn't seen given to anyone in years. From the shadows, Seojun watched more figures emerge. They came from behind rusted dumpsters and out of the darkness of the bridge's inner arches, the forgotten, the invisible, the broken. There were others like Harold, a woman wrapped in a tattered wool blanket, a young man with hollowed eyes and a persistent cough. They didn't scramble or fight like the street thugs Seojun managed. They approached with a quiet, reverent order, as if they were entering a sanctuary. Seojun's hand, which had been poised over his weapon just moments ago, slowly fell to his side. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of shame that burned hotter than his previous suspicion. He had spent weeks imagining her as a rat or a thief, projecting his own cynical darkness onto her. He had expected to find a handoff of secrets. Instead, he was witnessing a handoff of hope. Every night, while he sat in his ivory tower calculating his next move against the triads, she was here, risking her safety in the city's most dangerous corners to ensure these people had one decent meal. She wasn't selling his secrets. She was sharing her own life, spending her modest wages and her limited rest hours to play the role of a guardian. Harold took a long, shaky breath after his first bite, a faint smile ghosting across his weathered lips. "You're a saint, Danielle," the old man rasped. Danielle let out a soft, humble laugh as she moved to the next person. "No, Harold, just someone who knows what it's like to be hungry." Seojun stood paralyzed, the shadow behind the wall, finally beginning to understand that the woman he thought he was protecting was the only one in the entire city who didn't need his protection. She needed his help. He watched her for a long time, the cold air no longer biting quite as hard, as the feared mafia boss realized he was looking at the first thing his money could never buy: pure, unadulterated mercy. The silence of the alleyway was broken only by the distant hum of the city and the rhythmic clinking of plastic containers as Danielle packed up to move to the next huddled group further down the block. Seojun waited until her silhouette vanished around the corner of the bridge's massive stone pier before he stepped fully into the dim light. He didn't look like a man of the streets. His tailored overcoat caught the amber glow of the flickering bulb, and his presence alone seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Harold Thompson didn't flinch as the shadow loomed over him. He simply continued to scrape the last of the gravy from his container, his movements slow and deliberate. He had lived long enough to know that men who looked like Seojun were usually the ones who brought the storm, but a full stomach provided a strange kind of courage. "She's gone for the night, if you're looking to cause her trouble," Harold rasped without looking up. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Seojun didn't reach for his weapon this time. Instead, he stood with his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the spot where Danielle had been kneeling moments before. "I'm not here for trouble," Seojun replied, his voice low and gravelly. "I want to know the catch. Nobody gives away food like that. Not in this city. Who is she working for?" Harold let out a dry, wheezing chuckle that turned into a cough. He wiped his mouth with a tattered sleeve and finally looked up, his clouded eyes searching Seojun's sharp, intense face. "The catch? You're looking for a hidden ledger or a secret boss, aren't you? You think kindness is just a front for something uglier." Seojun's jaw tightened. In my experience, it usually is. Then your experience is a poor one, son, Harold said, leaning back against the cold stone. She's been coming here every night for 2 years. Rain, snow, or heat that would melt the asphalt. She doesn't ask for names, she doesn't ask for favors, and she sure as hell doesn't work for anyone but her own heart. Why? Seojun pressed, his voice taut with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. She's a waitress. She makes pennies. Why spend it on people who can't give her anything back? Harold reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph, though he didn't show it. He just held it close to his chest. She told me once back when the winter was trying to kill me. She said she does it because once upon a time, she was the one sitting on the crate. She lost everything, her parents, her home. She was a ghost in this city, invisible to everyone except one man who brought her a meal every single day until she could stand on her own 2 feet. She isn't paying a debt to us. She's paying a debt to the man who saved her. The words hit Seojun with the force of a physical blow. He thought of his own empire, built on the debts of others, on the fear he cultivated like a dark garden. He had spent his life ensuring everyone owed him something, yet here was a woman who lived her life trying to settle a debt of grace she didn't even owe to the people she was helping. She's the only real thing in this whole rotten town, Harold whispered, his eyes closing in exhaustion. If you're looking for a secret, that's it. She's exactly who she looks like. Seojun turned away, the weight of the old man's words settling into his bones. He looked at the crumbling stone wall, the same one he had hidden behind with a gun in his hand, and felt a profound, shivering sense of displacement. He had come looking for a traitor, but he had found a mirror that showed him exactly how empty his kingdom truly was. The cold night air seemed to thicken as Seojun walked back toward the edge of the shadows, his mind reeling from Harold's words. He stopped just before the corner of the bridge, his body partially shielded by the stone pillar. He looked back at Danielle, who had reappeared at the far end of the alley. She was crouched low again, this time beside a young woman holding a shivering child. The suspicion that had fueled Seojun's every move for weeks was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching clarity. He watched as Danielle pulled a small knitted blanket from one of her bags, something she must have purchased with her own meager tips, and wrapped it around the child's shoulders. There was no hesitation in her movements, no look of disgust at the grime of the alley, and certainly no sign of the rat he had been so certain he would find. Seojun felt a strange, jarring sensation in his chest, a tectonic shift of his entire worldview. In his world, power was measured by how many people bowed to you. In Danielle's, it was measured by how many people you could lift up. He looked at his own hands, hands that had signed off on hits, hands that had collected protection money from businesses not much different from the bistro where she worked. He had called himself a king, but standing in the damp dark of this alley, he felt like a beggar. He was frozen, unable to move or breathe normally. The realization of her secret hit him with a weight more crushing than any physical blow. She wasn't just feeding them, she was bleeding herself dry for them. She lived in a tiny apartment, wore the same faded coat every day, and walked miles in the rain just to ensure that a group of strangers didn't go to bed with the same gnawing hunger she had once known as an orphan. A sudden memory flashed through Seojun's mind, the way he had barked orders at her for more coffee, the way he had looked at her as just another dispensable part of the scenery. He had suspected her of being a thief because he couldn't conceive of a person who didn't take, but Danielle Brooks didn't take. She gave until there was nothing left, and then she found a way to give more. The street lamp above flickered and died, plunging the alley into deep violet shadows, but Seojun could still see the outline of her white apron. It was the only pure thing he had seen in years. He realized then that he had been stalking a saint with a gun in his pocket. The shock didn't just leave him still, it left him transformed. The mafia boss who had walked into this alley died in that moment of silence, and a man who was finally, painfully awake took his first breath. He didn't know what he would say to her yet, but as he watched her head back toward the bus stop, he knew one thing for certain. The city of Seoul was about to change, and it would start with the woman who had nothing, and the man who realized his everything was worth nothing at all. The following afternoon, the high-end bistro was bathed in a deceptive, golden peace. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light over white linen tablecloths, and the soft clink of silverware provided a rhythmic backdrop to the hushed conversations of the city's elite. Seojun sat at his usual corner table, but the man who occupied the seat was a stranger to the one who had sat there only yesterday. He didn't look at the menu. His eyes were fixed on the kitchen doors, waiting for the only person in the room who truly mattered. When Danielle finally emerged, the change in Seojun's perception was visceral. He didn't see a simple waitress or a potential threat. He saw a woman who carried the weight of the city's forgotten on her slender shoulders. As she moved between tables with her quiet, focused grace, she looked to him like a figure from an ancient cathedral, luminous, resilient, and entirely out of place in a world built on greed. Every time she smiled at a customer or adjusted a setting, Seojun felt a sharp, internal pang. He thought of her kneeling in the dirt of the third ward, the same hands now holding porcelain plates, having spent the night distributing hope in the dark. She approached his table, her expression as calm and professional as ever. "The usual today, Mr. Kang?" she asked, her voice the same melodic hum that had comforted Harold Thompson just hours before. Seojun looked up at her, and for the first time he found it difficult to maintain his composure. He noticed the slight shadow of fatigue beneath her eyes, a testament to her secret midnight vigils. He saw the faint redness of her hands, worn by the cold wind and the heavy bags of food. To any other patron, she was just an efficient employee, but to Seojun, she was a revelation. He realized that while he had been playing at being a god with his money and his violence, she had been doing the real work of a higher power. "Just coffee, Danielle," he managed to say, his voice uncharacteristically soft. As she turned to fulfill the order, Seojun found himself looking at the empty chair across from him. For years, that chair had been a symbol of his isolation, a place where no one was worthy or trusted enough to sit. Now, it felt like an invitation. He imagined her sitting there, not as a waitress, but as an equal, her kindness finally met with the security she deserved. He realized that his wealth, which had always been a scorecards of his sins, finally had a purpose. The restaurant's air, usually thick with the scent of expensive wine and arrogance, suddenly felt stifling. Seojun watched Danielle from across the room, seeing her in a holy light that exposed the darkness of his own life. He wasn't just infatuated anymore, he was awakened. The mafia boss who took what he wanted was gone, replaced by a man who was beginning to understand that the greatest power wasn't in being served, but in serving those who had nothing. He gripped his cup, his eyes never leaving her. As he began to formulate a plan that had nothing to do with territory, and everything to do with the grace he had witnessed in the shadows. The restaurant emptied as the afternoon light shifted into a deep, bruised purple. Seojun remained at his table long after his coffee had gone cold, watching Danielle finish her closing duties. When she finally hung up her white apron, the exhaustion he'd glimpsed earlier seemed to settle over her like a heavy cloak. She moved toward the exit, but Seojun rose, his presence commanding the quiet space. "Danielle," he said, his voice steady but stripped of its usual edge. She startled, her hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Kang, I'm sorry, I thought you'd left." She looked toward the door, then back at him, her instinct for service momentarily masking her fatigue. "Did you need something else?" "I was at the bridge last night," he said simply. The color drained from her face. Her posture, usually so upright and resilient, seemed to wilt. She didn't deny it, didn't offer a clever excuse about stolen property or lost hours. She simply looked at the floor, her fingers twisting the strap of her bag. "I'm sorry about the food, sir. The kitchen was going to throw it away. I didn't think." "I don't care about the food," Seojun interrupted, stepping closer. "I want to know why. You work 12 hours a day, you live in a city that ignores you, and yet you spend your nights in the coldest corners of this town. Why, Danielle? What is the catch?" Danielle looked up, and for the first time the waitress was gone. In her eyes was a steel that matched his own, tempered by a fire he didn't understand. She took a slow, shaky breath. "There is no catch, Mr. Kang. I do it because I know what the hunger feels like. Not the kind of hunger you get when your meeting runs long, but the kind that eats at your soul. The kind that makes you feel invisible." She leaned against a nearby table, her gaze drifting toward the window. "When I was 10, my parents were taken from me. I didn't have a name to the world. I was just another stray on the sidewalk. I spent 3 years begging in the shadows of buildings just like this one, watching people in suits walk past me as if I were a ghost. Her voice trembled, but she didn't break. There was a man, an old man who sold newspapers. He barely had enough for himself, but every single day at sunset, he brought me a warm bun and a carton of milk. He never asked for my story. He never asked for a thank you. He just made sure I stayed alive. He taught me that a single act of kindness isn't just a meal, it's a reason to keep breathing. Seojun stood in a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped. He had spent his life believing that mercy was a weakness used by the desperate to trick the powerful. But as Danielle spoke, he realized that the newspaper man hadn't been weak. He had been the most powerful person in that young girl's life. "I promised myself then," Danielle whispered, "that if I ever made it out, I would be that person for someone else. I'm not a saint, Mr. Kang. I'm just paying back a debt that can never truly be settled." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his, and Seojun felt a crushing weight in his chest. He had come for the truth, and he had found it, but it was a truth that made his entire empire look like a mountain of ash. The shadows in the empty restaurant seemed to lengthen, but Danielle's gaze remained steady, anchored by the memory of the man who had changed the trajectory of her life. She pulled out a chair, her movements weary but fluid, and sat across from the place where Seojun had spent so many hours watching her. "That man, the newspaper vendor, he didn't just give me food," she said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "He gave me the ability to see a tomorrow. When you're starving, the world shrinks until there is only the gnawing in your stomach and the cold on your skin. You stop thinking about being a person. You start thinking like an animal. You begin to believe that the world is a cruel, empty place where only the predators survive." Seojun felt a sharp prick of recognition. He had built his entire life on that exact belief, that the world was a predatory machine. He sat down slowly, the weight of his tailored suit suddenly feeling like lead. "Every evening," Danielle continued, "he would walk 3 blocks out of his way to find me. He was old and his hip pained him, but he never missed a day. One winter, when the flu had me so weak I couldn't even sit up, he brought me a hot thermos of broth and a pair of wool socks. He sat with me for an hour in the freezing rain, telling me stories about his daughter who had moved away. He treated me like I was a human being, Mr. Kang. He looked at me and saw a girl, not a nuisance or a ghost. She looked at her hands, scarred and toughened by years of labor. That broth gave me the strength to keep walking until I found a shelter. Those stories gave me the dignity to believe I was worth saving. He died before I could ever buy him a meal in return, but he left me with a debt of grace. He showed me that one person, with almost nothing to their name, could be the difference between a life lost and a life found." She looked up at Seojun, her eyes searching his sharp, angular face. "He gave me a future I didn't think I was allowed to have. So now, when I hand a container of food to Harold or wrap a blanket around a child, I'm not just being kind. I'm making sure that the newspaper man's legacy doesn't die. I'm making sure that even in a city as cold as this one, someone is still looking out for the ghosts." Seojun stayed silent, his mind racing. He thought of the millions of dollars sitting in his offshore accounts, money born of fear, money that had never once been used to give someone a reason to keep breathing. He looked at Danielle, realizing that the waitress he had once pitied for her meager tips was, in fact, the wealthiest person he had ever met. She had a purpose that transcended survival. The silence between them wasn't the tense, predatory silence of the mafia world. It was a heavy, transformative quiet. For the first time in his life, Seojun didn't want to take. He didn't want to command. He wanted to understand how a man with nothing could create a future, and how a man with everything could have stayed so blind for so long. The debt of grace wasn't just Danielle anymore. It was beginning to take root in him, too. The silence that followed Danielle's story was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of 1,000 decisions Seojun had made in the dark. He looked at his hands, illuminated by the soft amber glow of the restaurant's late-night lamps, and for the first time, he saw them clearly. These were hands that had only ever known how to take, how to grasp for power, how to squeeze for information, how to signal for violence. He had built a fortress of wealth, but as he sat across from a woman who gave away her last cent to feed a stranger, he realized his fortress was a tomb. "The newspaper man," Seojun said, his voice low and vibrating with a new, somber resolve. He didn't have a syndicate. He didn't have a seat at the table of the city's elite, but he changed the world because he changed yours. Danielle nodded slowly, the exhaustion in her eyes replaced by a flicker of curiosity. She watched him, sensing the shift in the man who had been a permanent fixture of shadow in her corner booth. Seojun stood up, reaching into his jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon or a ledger of debts. Instead, he withdrew a heavy obsidian black card, a key to a fortune that most men could only dream of. My wealth was built on the idea that people are things to be used, Seojun said, placing the card on the white linen between them. I've spent my life fueling the very hunger you've been fighting. I've been the winter, Danielle. I've been the cold wind that makes people feel invisible. He looked at her, his intense, angular features softening in the dim light. I can't change what I've done, but I can change what happens next. You've been fighting this battle with pennies and leftovers. I want to give you a different kind of armor. Danielle looked at the card, then back at Seojun, her breath hitching. Mr. Kang, I don't want your money if it comes with strings. I won't be a part of. There are no strings, Seojun interrupted, his voice firm yet gentle. No interest, no favors, no blood. Consider it a payment on a debt I've ignored for 30 years. I want you to buy the food, the blankets, the medicine. I want you to find a building, a real place with heat and beds, where Harold and the others don't have to hide under a bridge like ghosts. He leaned in, his dark tattoos visible at the collar of his suit, a reminder of the man he was, juxtaposed against the man he was becoming. The cycle of this city has always been one of taking until there is nothing left. Tonight, that cycle breaks. You provide the heart, Danielle. I'll provide the walls. For a long moment, Danielle didn't speak. The tears she had held back during her story finally traced paths down her cheeks. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the edge of the card. In that quiet restaurant, the feared boss of the Korean Mafia and the waitress with the natural bun and the white apron made a silent pact. Seojun felt a strange, terrifying lightness in his chest. He was no longer just a predator watching from the shadows. He was a man finally stepping into the light, realizing that the greatest use of power wasn't to command an empire, but to fund a miracle. 6 months later, the bite of the winter wind hadn't changed, but the alleyway beneath the stone bridge sat empty. The ghosts had moved. A few blocks away, a refurbished brick building stood glowing like a lantern against the twilight. Above the entrance, a simple, elegant sign read, "The Thompson Sanctuary." It wasn't a fortress of concrete and steel, but it was the most impenetrable territory Seojun had ever claimed. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of slow-simmered beef and fresh bread. The space was filled with the low, steady hum of voices, not the hushed, terrified whispers of the streets, but the sound of people who finally knew where their next meal was coming from. Harold Thompson sat at a central table, no longer perched on a milk crate, but resting in a sturdy chair, his weathered face lit by a warmth that hadn't come from a flickering street lamp. In the industrial-sized kitchen, the rhythm was seamless. Danielle moved with her signature focused grace, no longer wearing a faded coat or a weary expression. She wore a clean apron, her hair tied back in a neat bun, looking every bit like the leader she had always been in the dark. Beside her, the most feared man in the city had traded his black suit jacket for a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate ink on his forearms as he worked. Seojun wasn't sitting at a corner table watching from afar anymore. He was standing at the counter, carefully portioning out meals. He didn't move with the lethal efficiency of a predator, but with the steady, quiet humility of a man who had finally found a debt worth paying. Every time he handed a plate to a neighbor, he didn't see an asset or a threat. He saw a human being. "The delivery for the new beds arrived this morning, Danielle," Seojun said, his voice low and grounded. "And the medical wing should be staffed by Monday. I've ensured the local patrols know this building is off-limits, to everyone." Danielle paused, wiping her hands on her apron as she looked out at the crowded room. She turned to Seojun, her eyes bright with a peace that surpassed anything he had ever bought with his millions. "You've given them more than a building, Seojun. You've given them a name again." She reached out, her hand momentarily resting on his tattooed arm, a gesture of trust that shattered the last of his cold, mafia exterior. Seojun looked at her, then at the room full of people who were no longer invisible. He realized that his life had been a long, dark walk through the rain until he had followed a waitress with a heavy bag into an alleyway. The boss and the waitress stood together in the heart of the sanctuary, two unlikely allies who had turned grief and power into a legacy of grace. As the first snow began to fall outside, the windows of the foundation remained bright. The cycle of taking had finally been buried, replaced by a promise that as long as the lights were on, no one in their world would ever have to be a ghost again.